So I would like to bid you all a very warm welcome to our event series DSA Special. And the title of today's event is Ad Tech Out of Control. My name is Alexandra Gese. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens AFA Group. I'm from Germany and I'm the co-chair of the Greens Working Group on Digital Matters. And I'm shadow rapporteur for the Parliament's own initiative report on the Digital Services Act. So what are we doing here this week? We are having a series of 3 events on the Digital Services Act because most of us know that we are expecting a commission draft of the Digital Services Act on December 9th. It was supposed to be December 2, but now it's December 9th. Very understandable considering the horrible COVID situation in Brussels, that it's very difficult for the Commission at this point to finalize the draft. But this draft is going to do something very special. It's going to reform the 20-year-old e-commerce directive. And it gives us the opportunity to completely rethink what we want our interconnected digital world to look like. And we know how necessary this is. I think we all have been following the discussions in the United States as well. The US elections that have really shown us again how dire we need to do something about the internet to make it a place where a democratic society can really thrive. The real question is, how do we do that? And that's where the opinions really, really differ. So we organized an event series this week to deepen the discussion around 3 key elements that I deem indispensable for the upcoming legislation, which are algorithmic transparency, which we discussed yesterday, strict boundaries or possibly a ban for targeted advertising, which is our topic of today. And tomorrow we are going to speak about independent social media councils, which is an idea that in Europe is rather new. And I'm very happy to announce that we will have Roger McNamee from the Real Facebook Oversight Board, who is going to join us tomorrow. But let's start from today. Ad tech, out of control. I'm very happy to welcome also the distinguished speakers that are here with me on this virtual panel. And I would like to start with Clare. Clare, can you say hi so people can see who you are? Clare is the founder of the NGO Global Disinformation Index. And Global Disinformation Index is extensively researching the linkage between the financing and the spread of disinformation in ad tech. She is an experienced CEO in the commercial and not-for-profit sectors and an expert in building and managing cross-sector coalitions. Clare was formerly CEO of the International Business Leaders Forum and MD of MTV Networks Nordics. She has worked on startups in e-commerce, fintech, and ad tech. Great to have you here, Clare. Then we have Johnny Ryan. Dr. Johnny Ryan's works focuses on surveillance, data rights, competition, antitrust, and privacy. He's a senior fellow at the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. Before that, he was the Chief Policy and Industry Relations Officer at Brave, a private web browser. Johnny led Brave's campaign for GDPR enforcement and liaised with government and industry colleagues globally. His work on online advertisement and the complaints that he has filed with DPAs have been covered by the New York Times, The Economist, Wired, Le Monde, and the Financial Times. And he wrote an important letter to the Commission as well. And before his job at Brave, he worked in the field of tech and media. And so I'm very happy that possibly the most renowned European expert in this topic is giving us this exclusive briefing today. Good to see you here, John. And then we have Tom van Bentheim and Linda Worp. Still have trouble pronouncing Dutch names, I'm sorry, although we're neighbors, but they are from Ster, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the advertising branch of the Dutch national broadcaster NPO. And since the 1st of January 2020, Ster stopped all advertising cookies completely. Within this talk, Tom and Linda will show you why they made this decision and what are the consequences for consumers and for advertisers. And last but not least, they will open up the business case and show the results from a publisher's perspective. There's two of them today here. I would start with Tom. Tom von Bentheim is Ster's digital team manager. With the online advertising changes due to GDPR, he started immediately looking at technical solutions in order to make sure the revenue wouldn't suffer. And as a team manager digital, he is ultimately responsible for the online advertising business results. Linda Worp is Ster's digital product manager, and she's a digital, as such, she's responsible for the development of online advertising products. With the trends in the market, changes in legislation, and the wishes from advertisers, she needs to make the right choices in order to make sure the online revenue will still grow. Good to have you tonight, Linda and Tom. I would like to start with just a few introductory remarks to targeted advertising and why we are dealing with it tonight. Some of you might know that the European Parliament passed a report on the Digital Services Act, the URI report on the Digital Services Act, requesting a clear ban on personalized advertising. And that's already the second time the European Parliament votes for a ban on targeted advertising. Other reports are calling for stricter transparency rules, at least for targeted advertising. But what does targeted advertising actually mean? It means collecting huge amounts of data, creating micro profiles in order to target consumers directly. And that means that they're being followed in the internet from one side to the other, and that data collected online and offline is aggregated in order to create very precise profiles. And that raises questions and issues from different points of view. There's a violation of privacy and GDPR, and Johnny is going to go into that. Microprofiles can also be used for political disinformation and misinformation and to keep users engaged, and Clare will go into that. And we have seen at the US elections that we have a situation where, for example, American voters don't have a shared reality anymore. We saw that almost half the population was convinced that there was electoral fraud being committed. Also, all the experts said that wasn't the case, and the other half of the populations obviously wanted the votes counted. But it's not opinions that differ. It's really that people have the feeling their factual basis is completely different. And that is something we cannot deal with in a democracy. That makes it really, really difficult to live together in the long term. But then there's another factor I would like to mention, and that is quite important for European publishers. And I've been in a lot of conversations with them in the past weeks. It's the key. Targeted advertising, microprofiling is the key to the success of the business models of Facebook and Google. 98% of Facebook revenue comes from digital advertising, and most of it is programmatic, that is targeted, and 70% of Google revenues. And it is rising. A market that practically didn't exist 20 years ago today is dominated by Google and Facebook. They hold 75% of the German and the French market. And now there's another player coming in, but it's not a European company. It's not a European media outlet. It's Amazon. And this gives these companies their enormous financial power and all the problems competition that we are experiencing on the European market, and the European Commission is trying to control in very different ways. And the problem for publishers in Europe and all over the world globally is that they're basically forced, or they feel forced to go along with it. They are doing it themselves. So every time we visit the website of a newspaper to be informed, even high quality websites or high quality media outlets, we are being tracked and traced. We have to give up our data. We are being nudged and giving consent and so on. And the publishers have to go along with it, even if they don't feel comfortable with it, because they feel otherwise they lose an important stream of revenue. So what we're also trying today is to show an alternative, to show that if we ban targeted advertising altogether, alternatives exist. Because so far there have been efforts in Europe, for example, with the privacy regulation, to at least give users a choice, to have GDPR enforced, to have a real choice for users to opt in or out of targeted advertising. But publishers themselves have resisted that change because they are afraid of losing their revenue stream, while they think that Google and Facebook will always be able to obtain consent in some other place, but they won't. So they see that as a competitive disadvantage for them. So probably the easier way to deal with it is to ban targeted advertising and that kind of data collection altogether, and to enforce that ban. But in order to make sure we can still finance European media outlets, we want to show an alternative, and we are very happy to have found that, and Linda and Tom are going into that. So I still have to do some housekeeping. We are all used to video conferencing by now, I think. We will have 10 minutes introductory remarks, maybe Linda and Tom, well, two of them, they have 15 minutes from our two speakers and one speaker team each. And then around 7 p.m. we will start Q&A. You can submit questions. This is an interactive meeting. You can submit questions in writing in the Q&A tool. Please not in the chat, but in the Q&A tool. If there are questions, you can write remarks in the chat, but questions in the Q&A tool. And you can also raise your hand if you want to ask your question orally or come in and discuss with us. We will see that and draw up a list and then call you. So please make sure your devices work, your microphone works, if you want to come into the debate after we heard the speeches and the presentations. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar. So if you want to intervene orally and to speak with us, your voice will be recorded. I will call everybody only by first names for the sake of privacy. The written questions and the oral questions, but still your voice will be heard because we are recording this. So if you don't want to be heard, just put the question in the Q&A tool. We probably won't be able to answer all the questions, but we do our best. Okay, I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. So I'm able to give the floor to the first speaker, and that is Dr. Johnny Ryan. You'll have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So I have, I believe, 10 minutes, which I'll interpret as 10 minutes. Okay, let's get cracking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set out just how bad the bad news is. The bad news is pretty bad. And this will set things up very nicely for Tom and Linda to talk about what the good news is. Maybe what's useful is if in these 10 minutes, I start off by explaining what this stuff is, RTB, real-time bidding, and it's a big part of online behavioral advertising. And I'm going to take you into the jargon and how the system works, and then I'll show how the market works and why this is a problem for publishers today. There are problems with the status quo that really are not sustainable, and they are not only privacy problems. So let's start with a hypothetical game. Let's imagine I happen to have, as it happens, some baby infant moisturizer. My children are now too old for this, so I now use it on myself. Let's imagine we are playing a hypothetical game where we are marketing this product or something like it. And we are, let's imagine it's Renew, right? They're named for the Renew group. And it's Renew moisturizer. Now we might have a whole lot of people who we already have information on because they're our customers and we've made contact with them. Whatever information we have about these people is useful, and we might also buy other information about people who we want to reach. All of this stuff is very handy for us because it helps us figure out who we want to advertise to. So we store this information inside a tech company called a DMP, a data management platform. And what the DMP does is it puts a shape on the information we have, and it also allows us to buy more information about those people from data brokers. Now, there's plenty of DMPs out there in the world. The most famous one is Cambridge Analytica. This is very useful for us because we're going to be participating in millions, maybe billions of auctions for ad spaces. We can't be present at each auction. We need to have agents who attend each auction and then bid according to instructions that we give. Now that agent is the DSP, the demand side platform. The DSP needs to hear from us what kind of person we want to reach and how much we're willing to spend on them. So it requests that segment of people from the DMP. The segment might be individuals. So Alexandra, who is known as 234561725, or it could be, we're looking for political people in the Brussels area. It could be lookalikes, broad characteristics. Now, along comes, let's imagine my wife Caroline loads up a website, and when she requests the page with her browser, she types in website.com, and in split seconds, the website sends her the editorial content. But the rectangles around the editorial content that should contain ads are still empty for just a microsecond, just a split second. And if that rectangle has not been sold some other way, then the website in a panic contacts an ad tech company called a supply side platform. So Caroline is being supplied into a demand. The supply side platform gets as much information, which I've euphemistically referred to as cookie to SSP in this diagram, as much information about Caroline as it can, and it packages that up into information about her that is sent to at least one auction house. Each auction house now presents to tens or hundreds or maybe thousands of DSPs the opportunity to show an ad to this lady Caroline who's on this website. And we think Caroline is the kind of person who will buy this product either for her husband or for one of her 2 children, which was the case. And so we make the winning bid. And our ad is put in one of the rectangles on the page she has loaded. And very often there's an opportunity for a DMP involved to sneakily get its way onto the page and update its profile of Caroline too. And just before anyone thinks that this looks like a functional market, all of these colorful cogs are very often owned by the same company. Not always Google, but the supply side and the demand side, same company. This is not how you would conduct an auction in the real world. But of course, with billions at stake, this is the real world. Now let's do this twice more with feeling so that the jargon, gets through your eyeball and kind of deadens the inside of your very soul. Okay, let's imagine that I visit the Daily Bugle. The Daily Bugle is doing something called header bidding. This is an auction of auctions. So the Daily Bugle sends information about me to not just one auction house or ad exchange, but to many. And the logic of this is obvious. It maximizes the number of possible bidders, of DSPs, demand side platforms, of possible bidders who will see the thing that they're trying to sell. They're trying to sell my attention on that rectangle. And if you were trying to sell your house today, you would want the most number of people to turn up for that auction. The problem is, okay, in the short term, it looks like the website makes a buck and the right person is shown the right ad. But the real problem is we've no idea where the data go. As soon as they leave the website, there are no guarantees for their security. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Any of these parties, and there could be 1,000 or more in a single ad being shown in a very extreme case, and any of these parties could hold on to the data, pass it on to others, who knows, right? Now we know about one such company, a DSP, because the French enforcer, which did a pretty terrible job overall in this case, but at least they went into one of the thousands of DSPs, and they went into Vectory. Tiny company, no one had ever heard of it, doesn't matter. They investigated the wrong company here. But anyway, turnover of 3.5 million in the preceding year, not a major player. And yet Vectory had hoovered up 67.7 million people's data just by sitting in on these auctions. When you visit Vectory's website today, this is the nonsensical claim that will confront you. But if you scroll down the page, they make some better than the industry average claims. They say, we store only 30% of the data, we dump everything after a year. But if you're doing the maths, maybe they didn't get 68 million people's data, maybe they got 250 million, who knows? But it gives you a sense of the scale. So the third time, with even more feeling, in 30 seconds, this is what happens. This is slowed down when you visit a web page. SSP sends information about you to at least one ad exchange, and that is broadcast. That's the verb that I would use here. this personal information is broadcast out to a very, very large number of companies. Often, as you see in step 5, there's a chance for many companies as well to find out more about you and sync and update their profiles. Now, this is only a data breach if the personal data involved are in fact personal. So what is being sent? We can know because there are 2 rule books, really only 2. I don't have time to go into the detail here. I'm just going to scroll through an example that they give to engineers who participate in this system, who build the tech for it. So here's an example of what could be in a bid request. Often it's the entire URL. In this example, it's just the name of the website. 2 very specific identifiers here, much more granular than your social security number, for example. Now we see we're dealing with a young lady, another identifier on her device, her IP address, more stuff about her device. So we could guess that we're seeing her again, even if we didn't have the IDs. And finally, we've got where she's standing. So this is undeniably personal and probably special category, very sensitive data. Not only because, in addition, you can also send out more information in one system. You can send out this kind of information about what she's reading. In Google's system, they no longer do that, thanks to yours truly, but they still send out the entire URL, which is revealing itself. And also, once you get the URL, you can automatically visit it and extract category tags from it. So how big is this problem? And I'm going to go maybe 2 minutes over time, if you'll allow me, Alexandra. What's the scale of this problem? The big guys are operating in the tens of millions of auctions a day. Index Exchange is one of the big guys, but actually it's the smallest of the big players. Google is by far the biggest, but you won't get a figure out of Google for very good reason, although maybe they've no reason to be afraid of DG Comp. But anyway, for very good reason, they won't give the true figures. Certainly, we're dealing with hundreds of billions of these leaks every day. And the upshot is that everyone you've ever known almost certainly has been profiled using this system. Now, the industry's approach is to cover this illegality, the biggest data breach ever recorded, which happens every day, hundreds of billions of times, with an incredibly thin veneer of legality, magical consent rectangles that make the problem go away. Really, the only honest consent message I've ever seen is on this website from Chris Hoofnagel. And it is, I think, dishonest to try to ask for consent for this data breach. And the IAB, who represents this industry, seems to have understood this in their correspondence with the Commission dating back to before the GDPR. Now, the question is, how could this be lawful? And the answer is it clearly is not. In the GDPR, you're not allowed to have the data if you can't protect it. But public documentation from the IAB makes very clear that thousands of companies can receive the data from a single ad being shown, and that there's no technical way to control what happens to the data once this has happened. In Google's case, I'm going to skip this slide. In Google's case, Google says, if you're going to use our system, please don't use the data for anything that you shouldn't use it for. And if you plan to break our rules, please fax us immediately at your earliest convenience and tell us that you're going to break our rules. Now, the final thing to say is that this broadcast of information about a publisher's audience is an unbelievable act of self-harm, which needs to be remedied, even if there were no data breach. A person visits a legitimate high-end website, and that person, John in this case, reads about business and then reads about an expensive thing like an automobile. This broadcast in the real-time bidding system lets hundreds or thousands of companies find out about John, know that he is an expensive person who reads the Daily Bugle and wants to buy a car. In the short term, the Daily Bugle gets a short-term win because an ad is shown. But in the long term, there's a terrible consequence. When John visits bikinibabes.com or destroytrust.com or latestconspiracy.eu, whatever it is, that website sends out its bid request, and all of these companies in the middle now see that they can buy the Daily Bugle's audience, which they only want because it's the Daily Bugle's audience. And this is a part of the audience that wants to buy a car, that they can show an ad for Audi at an enormous discount. And so the ad ends up being shown on the worst parts of the web. And what happens here is that the publisher has allowed their audience to be commodified and arbitraged and allowed a business model to be built up for the bottom of the web. And the problem gets slightly worse. I'm going to click through this quickly. If John isn't even a human being, if John's visit to the Daily Bugle was intended to allow a fraudulent website to take money from advertisers. So we end up with a system where, because of the leakage of data, advertisers are subject to either single or double-digit billion euro fraud a year, where the tech industry extracts 70 to 55% of every euro spent, and where the seller, the publisher, is allowing its audience to become a commodity. And I'm going to skip through the rest of my slides because I'm already way overdue, but I think they explain themselves, right? Couldn't be clearer. So 3 points to leave you with, and I won't even articulate them because I'm way over. My apologies.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I mean, you're always so informative. I think it's the third time I'm seeing this, and I could still spend another 30 minutes with it just to get into the depth. But yeah, we want to keep it a little bit interactive, and therefore we're short of time. I think there will be a lot of questions. There are already coming in questions for you. So we will go back to the points that the audience is most interested in. And that gives me the possibility to give the floor to Claire. I think you have some slides as well to share with us.
I do indeed. I am presenting now. I hope you can see this. And unhelpfully, it has started where I didn't need it to. Okay, so thank you very much to Johnny. It's always a huge privilege to watch him talk on the subject. And hopefully what I will talk about will add a bit more weight and color to how this system that Johnny has just described has been weaponized by people who want to manipulate us into doing and believing different things. So disinformation is mostly thought about as a political thing, but it is also a business. And in a world where information, the ability to create information online is virtually costless, the amount of information that's out there has risen exponentially. And the reason that disinformation has grown, one of the reasons that disinformation has grown is because it is now possible to make money from this. And this is why. In the last 20 years, online advertising has gone from virtually nothing to virtually everything. It is now about $280 billion a year, and it far surpasses television. And this is effectively a gold rush. And like any gold rush, as Johnny has just very clearly illustrated, both well-meaning commercial actors move in, but also some more nefarious actors move in. And when you can create content for free, and the only way to get monetized, to get paid for that content is advertising, the way to capitalize on this enormous gold rush that we've seen in the last 20 years is to make sure you get a share of that advertising pie. And when there is so much content out there, the only way to do that is to make sure your content rises to the top. And therefore, making content that appeals to our negative emotions, our fear, our hate, our greed, our disgust, our anger, our outrage, is much more likely to get us to click, and therefore to trigger that whole process Johnny has just outlined and get an ad dollar for our content. And this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, that we are hardwired to react more quickly to our negative emotions than our positive emotions. It's more important in our caveman days to get out of the way of a charging woolly mammoth than it is to race to embrace a neighbor. So what has been created is a tool which taps into our primal unevolved brain and manipulates it for outcomes that were not the original intent of the system created. So it's very easy for us sitting here today to wonder about quite how big this disinformation for money problem is, because we probably, most of us, get the majority of our news by going direct to news sites. But what I want to do on this slide is illustrate for you quite how big a problem this is. Now, this is the Facebook fans for news sites. So it's the number of fans on Facebook as specific news sites have. And this is all fairly high quality news sites. Many of them are American, but you start off at the top with BBC News, and you can see that it has 50 million Facebook fans. This is a logarithmic scale, by the way. And you've got a whole bunch of other American news sites here, and not all American. This slide is junky news sites on Facebook. So again, it is the number of Facebook fans that these sites have on Facebook. And I want to point out two things. Firstly, there are a lot of bars on this page. Yes, it's American news sites, but there are a lot of them. And secondly, the scale is the same. It is the same logarithmic scale. So if I overlay those two graphs on one on the other, you can see that there are a huge number, of people, and we know that across many developed countries, about 50%, if not more, of people get the majority of their news through social media. The exposure of huge volumes of people to very junky content in their Facebook feed, in their Instagram feed, wherever they're getting their news, is likely to be high. A lot of people are seeing this stuff. So what does this stuff look like? I'm going to show a couple of slides here in the interest of time, which show some coronavirus disinformation. And on these slides, I'm going to highlight what the slide is, who the advertiser is, who's inadvertently ended up next to this content, and the ad exchange that placed the ad next to the content. So this is a site called Global Research. It is a story around how vaccinations are going to alter our DNA. So a very divisive narrative designed to undermine our trust in science and in the government response. The advertiser that ended up next to it is rather unfortunately the British Medical Association. Dear Diary is an app produced by the BMA. And we can, if you can see that very tiny, long, ugly string at the bottom of the page, you can see that the word Google in there. It is Google who is the ad exchange who placed that ad on that content. Now, you may never have heard of Global Research, but you have probably seen some of their stuff on Facebook. They might have only a small direct reach, 1.3 million people go directly to Global Research, but 40 million people see their content on social media. So social media is dramatically increasing the reach of some of these very divisive sites. Another example, this site is a site called Zero Hedge. This is a very large American site. It's a story about how the deep state have a conspiracy against anything to do with Russia, and any positive news coming out of Russia about their vaccine is clearly just another example of the deep state. So again, a narrative aimed at undermining our trust in government's response to the coronavirus vaccine. And the ad exchange that placed this ad is again Google. Zero Hedge gets 40 million direct visits a month, and again its reach is again augmented by its social media reach. So how does this happen? This happens because of several factors that Johnny has outlined and that I'm going to try and condense onto this slide. Firstly, online media sources have exploded. There is significantly more content, significantly more, billions of websites now that weren't around even 5 years ago. Secondly, as I showed on that first graph, advertising money has flooded into the internet. So there is a very large gold rush to go after. Thirdly, and Johnny described this brilliantly, there is a very opaque ad tech ecosystem that's been created. And the system was originally designed to make programmatic ads much more effective at getting us to buy things. As an aside, the system that was designed to get us to buy things is also incredibly effective at getting us to do and believe different things. So it has become the largest and most frightening behavioral modification system we've ever known as a human race, because our brains have not evolved since that caveman need to get out of the way of the woolly mammoth. And yet our ability to manipulate them has become truly terrifying. The schematic on the other side of the page is a very simplified version of the very complicated ad tech ecosystem, which I won't explain because that's already been gone through. So how big a problem is the financial motive to capture some of the ad dollars online through disinformation? Well, the truth is nobody knows. At the Global Disinformation Index, we did a study last year where we took a very small database that we had at the time of about 20,000 sites that are highly disinforming, and we estimated that they would have brought in about $250 million a year in ad revenues. As Johnny pointed out, the single biggest enabler of that, because they are the market leader, is Google. But as was also mentioned at the introduction, there are other companies, and Amazon is an even bigger player than it shows on this slide, who are also enabling these ads to it, who are big players in this marketplace. So disinformation is a business, but it is also very bad for business. This is one of a number of examples of studies that have been coming out more and more frequently, showing that when we see adverts next to very disinforming, polarizing, hate-filled content, we actually view those adverts and the brands behind them very negatively. This is a study of millennials, Gen Xers, who say that they are 50% less likely to purchase from a brand if the ad placement is inappropriate, even though, as we've seen, brands have very, very little control over where they end up. So businesses are increasingly aware that the system that's been created to enable them to get very accurate targeting at very cheap prices by going to getting the same audience, but on a much cheaper, less reliable, potentially disinforming website, isn't actually helping them, because ultimately consumers do not like to see ads funding bad content. And it's also not an efficient marketplace. This is a graph enumerating some of the points that Johnny made earlier. When I used to work in television, of every dollar an advertiser spent, roughly 80% would come to us as the television company that placed it there. That was more than a decade ago. Now it is at least 50%, but some studies show that that number is down to 27%. So a huge percentage of each dollar is taken off throughout that very complicated ecosystem. And this study by ISPA, which is a UK advertising trade body, couldn't account for 15%. 15% just disappears. Nobody knows where it goes. So this is not a marketplace that is functioning well. But what can we do? Well, one thing that we at GDI think would really help is to have a risk assessment of news sites on their risk of disinforming, which would give advertisers a choice over where they place their adverts. So we produce risk assessments. We use a combination of human intelligence and artificial intelligence. And we provide those risk assessments to ad exchanges, to brand safety companies, to DSPs, and to advertisers themselves, and enable them to use those ratings to help advertisers have more control over where their ads end up, direct their funding away from high-risk sites and back to high-quality news domains. If we achieve market-wide adoption of a risk rating system like this, we can break that link that I outlined earlier, where outrage, hate, fear, greed, disgust equals clicks, but it doesn't have to equal dollars. And we can do it in a way that protects freedom of speech. The right to say what you want should be protected, but the right to profit from it should not. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. That was also very informative. Really impressive that, I think it was the third slide, the logarithmic scale that compared the scale of the number of users visiting serious media outlets to the number of people visiting disinformation sites. That was really impressive. Do you have those numbers for Europe?
I don't, and it's very difficult to get them, but it's something that would be, I don't imagine we would see anything very different. The US has a more polarized media market, and it has a larger media market. So I think it would be just a smaller sample size, but probably a similar share of news is higher risk, is high risk.
Yeah, and it would be interesting for Europe to see it over time, because I mean, in the US that has started at a certain point as well, and we might be moving in the same direction. I hope we are not, but well, I'm glad we found, after all this really bad news, to have some good news to present. What can we do in Europe to get away from that model, keeping still some kind of advertising and keeping revenues for European publishers and media outlets? And with this, I would like to give Linda and Tom the floor. I don't know who of you wants to start. I suppose, Linda, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra, for having us. I think Johnny and Claire did a great job, and we're saving some time already, because I think we have a few sheets that are pretty much the same. Linda and I both work for the sales house of the Dutch public broadcaster, NPO. And what we did and what we started 2.5 years ago is a new way of online advertising. And yeah, what we want to inspire you that there are alternative solutions for publishers. Yeah, what we actually say is that there is a solution that works for publishers, and we divide it into 3 pillars. The first one is, of course, the audience. That's the audience is still, of course, more aware of their online privacy rights more than ever. And yeah, due to GDPR and e-privacy, they get the ability to turn off cookie-based advertising. And yeah, I can tell you already, this is spoiler, but if you ask it the correct way, 90% of the people opt out. Yeah, the other pillar is that we looked, of course, at our own revenue for the last few years and our business model. What we did is cut out all the middlemen. And now I can tell you already, instead of losing the 50% that Claire showed us in her previous presentation, we only have to pay for ad serving fees. So that's like 2 or 3% of our revenue. So as you can imagine, we upgraded our revenue, and we have a cut in loss in cost as well. And last but not least, but Linda will get into that, is that we looked at our advertisers specifically. So what is the value for opt-in versus opt-out advertising? So let's get started. When GDPR entered, it was the 25th of May 2018, of course. Because of the fact we're the Dutch public broadcaster, we have to comply with all legislation. So what we did from day one is adjust our consent pop-up. And you see an example on the left-hand side, which is a Dutch website NTR. But what it's shown there is that the last one is I want personalized ads. And if you have to do it like this, so we didn't predefine any answer, 90% of the people will opt out. So as you can imagine, we had, of course, a programmatic first strategy as well. We had to come up with a solution for the 90% of the people that opted out within 1 month. So that's what we did. And the learning we had, our key takeout is that consumers don't want their personal information to be abused for online advertising purposes. Yeah, this one is like Johnny showed it already, but in the old world, I would say it's kind of a complex landscape with all the different parties in between, like exchanges, DSPs, SSPs, and all the things all the advertisers do. It's all based on the user data. So what we did, and Claire covered this sheet already in her presentation. That's like the next one. Oh yeah, sorry, but instead of the complex world Johnny showed us, what we did is we made a really clean setup where there's only one advertiser, and the ad server we are running is only connected to advertise directly, agencies directly, DSPs directly, and also a self-service tool, which you can see on the bottom here. We call it Klant Portal. But what the key value of is that we host everything ourselves, we own everything ourselves, everything is built out in-house, so we're not dependent from, for instance, Google anymore.
And this slide also shows us, compared to the leakage of all the budget from advertisers in Claire's earlier graph, that with this setup we are very clean, and you have a direct link, and the advertisers know specifically where their budget goes to, and they are in charge to use an agency or a DSP, but the unknown delta is gone. And we are in charge as a publisher that we exactly know what is happening on our network. And previously, of course, all those cookies often were used to select the right audience or a specific audience with the ultimate goal to be as relevant as possible. And with our changes, you see on the left-hand side that whereas we don't use any consent, you also don't see any cookie data loaded on the page. And on the right-hand side is just a random example, whereas you see that a lot of publishers still have like 50 different data points. And we say that you don't need them in order to be relevant. Because of course, you can't select relevancy based on personal data anymore, but you still see which content piece is watched at that particular moment. And we all know context targeting via keywords, but we go one step further in our mechanism. So we look at all possible own metadata, and therefore we shifted the focus and the value from personal data-based to more content-based database. So we use our own information, such as descriptions from video and audio content, or even subtitles for video episodes and complete and written text for articles. And using these subtitles is especially useful for talk shows. Every episode has a different subject based on the conversations and people around the table. And the more metadata you have, the more accurate the context can be assigned to the content, of course. But even if you don't have all these elements available, the technique can add relevancy to your delivery. And all available words are counted, and the system weighs them towards our complete database. And the most important words with the highest scores will be selected and used within our word-to-fact model. And it looks basically like this. So within this model, words are assigned to the specific categories. And it looks at how often words occur together and what is the distance to the different categories or contexts. And here you see that because the word king is marked as very important in one of our fragments, it occurs to the model. And because the distance from king to royalty is small, this fragment is assigned to the royalty context. Of course, our advertisers also need to know what is in it for me. Does it work for my ultimate campaign goals? And in the beginning, or at least in 2019, we still had both routes available. So the part that we get consent for, the 10% Tom talks about, and the part without consent. And during that year, we challenged our advertisers to split their campaigns and look at their ultimate KPIs if they see a difference. So for example, looking at the results, overall we see no big differences between the campaigns with and without cookie data. And with Renault, we also looked further than only the traffic to the website and saw that also in terms of conversion rates, the campaign without cookies just as well performed as the campaign with cookies. And this, of course, is a very good sign for us and also for the advertiser, as we saw the same results for multiple advertisers and different campaigns. So we were confident enough to stop all cookies, also based on our research. Well, that's for the part of consent and no consent, but we also looked and checked our context solution. So here's a case of Eliza Was Here, which is a travel agency. They are used to target demographics specifically, and we split the campaign in two parts. So one half of the campaign was focused on reaching females who are at least 25 years old with a higher education and income. And the other half of the campaign was targeted on the context, travel and holidays. And during the campaign, they shifted their budget more and more to context targeting, as the results for them were much better compared to the outdated audience targeting. And of course, it's good to see the results for advertisers, but what's in it for the publishers themselves? We also need to answer to our boss that it was the right decision to stop all advertising cookies. And as Alexandra also already said, most publishers are afraid to go further and stop advertising cookies, as most of them rely on the income of the programmatic market. But in this graph, I will show you that our net revenue from 2019, whereas programmatic buys are also fully included, is less compared to what we see this year, where we stopped all cookie data. And although we couldn't use the same systems anymore, we still see that uplift. And we are very confident that this is not only the case for us, but also would be the case for other publishers. And in total, I can tell you already that we are already 20% overperforming in total revenue of last year, and there are still 6 weeks left. So we think this is a good business case. And of course, the question is, how is this possible? And we think that the answer is that we developed our ad serving possibilities. We developed the contextual systems. We have the right moment, and we have the proof with advertisers. So with all the research, they were also confident enough to keep coming back to us. So our conclusion, of course, with this presentation would be that there is a way of online advertising, whereas you don't need personal data and still can be profitable as a publisher. And we invite everyone who wants to join us and wants to do the same and experiment. Yeah, so that's also the end of our presentation. I'll give the word back to Alexandra, I guess.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was quite encouraging. And now I would like to encourage the audience. It's your turn now. We already have written questions, but that Johnny has already been answering. So if you want to come into the discussion, ask a question, please raise your hand now with the raise hand tool, and we can give you the floor. I have one question, maybe to break the ice to Claire. What you have just seen, the system of very successful contextual advertising, would that be a solution to the problem of disinformation for profit? How do you see that?
I think it can be a very useful part of the solution. Fundamentally, as humans, we are wired to react more to sensational stuff. So people will always be incentivized to create division and create outrageous things, because it's where we will click. So unless we have a way of labeling content as higher risk or lower risk, we'll still see the incentive to create divisive content as a way of attracting ad dollars.
So if that system were applied also to that kind of divisive content, it might not solve the problem actually, because it would just allow good brands to stay away from them, but it would still attract a lot of maybe low value customers to be targeted, well, without the targeting, but to go there. And is that correct? It'd be fantastic to see more publishers going down that route, but it's a route that the quality ones will go down. If you're in it to make money no matter what,
unless at the exchange level where the auction is held, there is a way of allowing an advertiser to choose the risk level that they're willing to accept, then we will still find advertisers' money ending up next to the content that gets the most clicks, and that which gets the most clicks tends to be the polarizing and divisive stuff.
What is your take on that, Johnny?
I'm sorry, I was busy typing an answer. There's a thread about Tom and Linda's revenue. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Let's keep some questions to discuss orally, because there's somebody raising their hands and right now, so we can pick up some of the questions you have been. So
now that I've been caught, I'm all ears. I will answer that later.
Has answered all the questions in writing even before we ended the presentation part. That is quite impressive. Now the question was, I was just wondering, because the idea was that ending targeting and targeted advertising would help to combat disinformation online.
Yeah.
But now actually it might help to shift the money of the most important brands that really want quality to high quality content, but there would still be a lot of devices content being created just to host everybody else's ads, basically. So do you see, how do you see that?
Well, I agree with the first thing you said, and I disagree with the second. I've spent quite a bit of time now with brands and the people who represent them. And although they talk about quality, they love to talk about quality, they don't actually do very much about it. So if we are going to wait for brands to move to quality, that's not going to happen. Claire may correct me, or she may strongly agree with me. I'd be curious to hear what she thinks. Brands are not going to be any part of the solution here at all. On the question of disinformation, if you have a system that is broadcasting what everyone is secretly and privately watching, reading, and listening to an unknowable number of companies, that means that everyone's innermost desires are now profilable, and you can now pour just the right bit of poison for me into my individual ear and not poison it into Claire's or Linda's or Tom's. But if we are going to close down that tap, that broadcast of our intimate secrets, as a colleague of mine when I used to work at Brave said, what's the Pope's favorite porn site, right? That's how secret we're talking. That's routine stuff, not necessarily for the Pope in bid requests. If we're going to close that down, it is obvious that there would no longer be anywhere near as great a resource for people to be micro-targeted with disinformation or with anything else.
Great.
I can come in a little bit on the advertisers. I'm a bit more optimistic about advertisers wanting to push for change here. And I think Linda and Tom showed that their advertisers were also demonstrating a willingness to try something new. Had you asked 2 years ago, I would have agreed completely with Johnny. We were getting the response, yeah, but disinformation is just people telling lies on the internet. Even Nazis buy toothpaste, to paraphrase Michael Jordan. We still want to sell to them. But I think there has been quite a big shift this year in people's understanding and advertisers, everyone's understanding of how dangerous disinformation is, how dangerous polarizing and toxic narratives are. And that's due to two things. One, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. It's not just people telling lies on the internet. If people put up stuff saying drinking bleach will cure your COVID and then people die, the real world harms of bad content on the internet have never been more visible. To those of us who work in this space, it's frustrating because the things like the anti-vax movement have been causing much greater infection rates from measles and even deaths from measles, which are completely unnecessary, for years. But at least now there is a much greater sense of the real world harms caused by this content. And the second thing that I think has been very helpful to raising everyone, and particularly advertisers, awareness of this has been the Black Lives Matter campaigns over the summer months, which have caused advertisers to realize that just going out with a sort of positive corporate social responsibility message of, yes, we support the Black Lives Matter movement, is not enough if their adverts are at the same time ending up next to racist, far-right, white nationalist content. If the right hand does not know what the left hand is doing, they will ultimately be punished for that by consumers. So I am more hopeful that advertisers will be pushing harder for an improved marketplace.
Claire, Alexandra, can I ask? Part of your job is to privately tell the advertisers, and then there's there are other groups who in public put pressure on the advertisers and say, look what you're paying for. So you have a better understanding, I think, than anyone else of how advertisers react before people realize they funded the wrong stuff. But here's the thing, they never checked. If you didn't tell them, and your organization's been around for 3 years, I think, but 2, right? So up until 2 years, no one was telling them. Those two other movements that are public in what they do didn't exist then either. They were spending billions and just throwing it against a wall because they believed in the myth of how well this stuff works. And, if they won't respond to their own bottom dollar, it amazes me if principle is going to be the thing that actually moves them.
Well, I would like to interrupt you here just to come in to bring in people from the audience. This is a fascinating discussion, but we have a couple of people waiting. I would like to give the floor to Ralph, who's first, and then after Ralph, it's Zara's turn, so you can get ready. Ralph, you have to unmute.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? You can even say my last name, Alexandra. I have nothing to hide in that regard. Ralph
We can see it on the screen, Ralph.
Yeah, okay. Advisor for the Greens in the European Parliament. I worked a lot on the GDPR back then with Jan Albrecht. So I put one question to Johnny, which you already answered in writing, that this is mainly a problem of enforcement of existing laws and maybe a problem with the Irish DPC, not necessarily a need for a new legislation that would explicitly ban targeted advertising. But I would be more curious to hear a bit more about the real-world incentives for publishers and advertisers to actually use this real-time bidding approach. Because, if only 50% of the money that the advertisers spend actually ends up with the publishers, and even 15% of those is somewhere lost and nobody can even account for it, why would publishers have an interest in using this model? And also the advertisers lose a large chunk of their advertising budget basically for a middleman. So I don't really understand. And also, is there any data on the actual success of such real-time bidding, targeted advertising? I mean, do they also track it, who got shown an ad and who then bought the actual product afterwards?
Yes, maybe this is something for Tom and Linda to.
May I just briefly come in on that? I can confirm by talking to my talks to the publishers, even especially like smaller newspapers, they say it's really a problem for them because they have to account for what happens on their website vis-a-vis German data protection authorities. So they have to answer these like 20 page long letters filling in who gets access to their data. So they have to write to all the companies that are on their website and they don't really know. And some told me, well, there are companies like from China who just answer our letters saying, well, we have no business whatsoever in Europe, so we're not giving any information. But that lady said, well, but I can see them, they're there. And she confirmed there's like 50% of revenue going to places where she had no idea where it went. So this is really something that basically everybody told me. It's really an issue, and it's interesting to see that in your figures. I would like to, before I give the floor to Johnny to respond, to answer this. I see we have a few people from the advertising industry in the audience as well. So if you want to raise your hand and come in, I'm happy to see you in the discussion, and I give the floor to Johnny.
Well, I was busy not taking the floor and suggesting Tom and Linda, but let me give an initial answer. Ralph, people aren't rational. And when I worked for a publisher called the Irish Times, my title was Chief Innovation Officer. Really, my job, among others, was to install the latest tech stuff or agitate for it to be installed so that we would not look like a dinosaur. Now, that was quite a while ago, but that was a big part of my job. And for example, I was putting or asking for social share buttons, I think that was me, to be put on our articles produced by a company called Add This, which is owned by, I think it's Add This, Oracle, which is a data broker, which was then selling the Irish Times audience just because every time an article loaded, there was a share button that loaded with it that reported to Oracle that someone had visited that article. So looking for a rational reason is not necessarily the best one. Publishers felt, I think, at least when I was working inside a publisher, so harmed by digital change. Everything that had happened since digital became a thing had been bad news for them, right? Everything, nothing had been good news. And so when something shiny comes along and says it's going to be great, and when the agencies are pushing it, which they were, you know, the odds are that you'll probably do it. Now, people did not understand and still don't this problem of audience data leakage. That's not a thing that is in most publishers' minds. Now, however, that they are all doing this, the question is, why haven't they, of course, switched it off as soon as they hear what the problem is? And the answer, I think, partly is that they are subject to a first mover disadvantage. So if Ralph is a publisher and Johnny is a publisher, and Ralph decides he's going to be really good and stop sending out information about the people who visit his page, Johnny's still sending out that information, and he will receive more money, bigger bids for his inventory. So there's a first mover disadvantage unless, for example, an enforcer wakes up and says, neither of you can do this. you just can't do that. And so the example of NPO and Ster is very unusual because they are partly state funded. And you see other companies like New York Times do this, who are in a strong position. And we've got someone called Eric from a company called Kobler that Alexandra, I'd suggest you should hear from. That's an unusual tech company that's doing something interesting too. But all the incentives are to focus on revenue this week or this month, and not to take a short-term hit, if there's going to be one, for a medium and long-term survivable strategy. No one is incentivized to think longer term. Great.
Before I give the floor to Sarah, does Linda want to come in?
Yeah, I think I can add some on that, what Johnny already said. Well, basically, when you are a publisher, you are using multiple exchanges because they all bid against each other, and with the ultimate goal, of course, to receive the most money for that one specific ad space. And for advertisers, on the other hand, the complete ecosystem evolved to have as much as data points available to reach the most interested audience. And they all wanted to be automatically, they all want to outperform every KPI. And they are not looking at a real bigger picture. And in the meantime, there are a lot of intermediate parties who aren't visible anymore, which resulted in unknown delta parts within the programmatic chain. However, as a publisher side, from our experience, when advertisers were using all the data points, for example, they used a specific demographic within their targeting, we couldn't deliver. We couldn't deliver as much as they wanted. And the first thing that our SSP said to us was, get rid of the audience targeting. It doesn't make sense, and you don't reach the right public. You need a broader reach. So also for them, and who are still working and believing in the programmatic system, we would say, quit, stop doing it.
Thank you, Linda. I would like to give the floor to Sarah for the next question.
Hi. Yeah, my question actually nicely ties in with something that Johnny just mentioned. Johnny, you said how Linda and Tom are working for a Dutch public broadcaster, so they're partly state funded. So Tom and Linda, I was wondering, in your presentation, you indicated that the GDPR was an important driver for you to change the model in which you ask consent and then really drop the amount of consent that you could get, and that also changed your advertising model. And I was curious, was it just the GDPR or were there other considerations? Like, for example, did the fact that you are a public broadcaster, that you have like a public service remit, did that play into your decision? Like, what were the other drivers? Because I can hardly imagine that it was just GDPR. And so how does that compare to other organizations that are just purely commercial?
Thank you.
I can answer this one. At first, my previous job at Ster was I was responsible for head of programmatic, so responsible for connecting all the exchanges, DSPs, SSPs. But then when GDPR entered, we had from day one we had to comply with the legislation. So then we had to come up with the solution we had, and later on we embraced it, and that's what we're the last 2.5 years have been doing. We're building on this alternative model, and we now use it. We turned our weakness into a strength, I would say. So, but first for us, it was kind of hard because we were responsible for the revenue, of course, but it declined in the first month with 90%.
And as a public broadcast, you need to be most strict of all compared to the commercial parties. So they were focusing on us at how we were doing that, and we couldn't make any mistake. But when you see that big answer from our audience with 90% that says, I really don't want my private information to be used for advertising purposes, we also need to look at ourselves. What have we done previously? Why were we doing that? And how can we make it possible to change that for our visitors as well? Because we are depending on our visitors in order to have inventory, in order to generate the sales.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because when we started this, 1 month later, we had a letter from the regulator in Holland. They looked into our solution. Of course, then we had to feedback them within 1 week. That's what we did. And then suddenly after like 6 months, they passed the investigation. So they didn't say we did a good job, but then they just passed the investigation. So that's, we, as you can imagine, we always say, okay, give us a stamp, give us an approval, but they're not doing that.
Okay, thank you. I would like to give the floor to Vincent, who is the next on the list, and then Abdelkader can prepare me after that. Vincent, you have the floor.
Hi, so I hope you can hear me. I have a question concerning the topic that I read a little bit through the feedback on the current discussion of the DSA, and I think one of the big tech companies there stated that it's much cheaper for companies to advertise online than offline, and that it is more efficient to do. So does the ending of the targeted advertising concern that in any case? I don't know who could answer it best.
Well, I think any of you could, but who would like to do that?
Can I just confirm what the question was? Was the question removing the ability to target people was what you're getting at, that it will make it more expensive to advertise online?
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I guess the companies who sell things want to reach people, and doing so efficiently leads them to advertise with targeted advertising. I guess they could always just advertise without a target, but they decide to do so. And I'm just wondering whether there is a study or something like that which looks at the consequences it would have on companies who want to advertise things, how much they would need to spend to reach as many people effectively, etc.
Yeah, I think the question, is it more expensive to do contextual than rather than targeting? Because that has been brought to my attention as well, that they're saying, well, especially smaller advertising clients, for them, it's easier to reach really their specific audience by targeting the advertising. You know, advertisers who wouldn't maybe place their ads at NPO, at a national broadcaster, but at smaller websites, for example. So would that be more expensive for advertising clients not to have targeting? I think that's more or less the question, if I understood that correctly. I don't know who wants to come in on that, Linda or Johnny?
So I think our colleagues at Ster have data on this because they've actually done the research themselves. But let me also say the estimates for the cost to advertisers of fraud, of software masquerading as people visiting websites in order to trigger ads, which are targeted at those fake people, not at the content. The estimates vary so wildly that they can't be relied on, but I'll give you a sense of them to give you a sense of the scope. The Association of National Advertisers in the US said that last year in the US alone, it was something like $5.6 billion. And they were reasonably widely castigated for being conservative. Juniper Research, which I don't know where they got this figure from, they said the global figure was $42 billion. I mean, the technical term for those estimates is bollocks, right? We've no idea what the truth is, but it seems to be billions. So if you weren't targeting quotation marks now, people, it would also mean you're not targeting those bots likely in the same way. You might have some other form of fraud, but this bot fraud problem wouldn't be the same problem that we currently have. And it's a multi-billion euro problem. Now that's a price, that's a cost that comes exclusively out of the pockets of advertisers. And I think it would be very, very much reduced. But Tom and Linda have the real data.
Johnny, could you just explain just briefly again what the problem is? So bots are used to increase the traffic on websites so the website can sell the ad spaces at a higher cost. Is that the problem?
Yeah. So
familiar with that.
Alexandra, if you set up a website that you never even intended a human to visit, now you could have humans visit it, but let's imagine you didn't bother. It's running on a little computer somewhere hidden away. And that website, you pay for traffic to visit that website. Now you don't want humans, you just want visits. And those visits could be from software pretending to be humans, running in a warehouse full of smartphones. Tens of thousands of people could visit every second. And what sometimes has happened is that the ads are shown 40 deep, ads on top of ads on top of ads. It's called ad stacking. So clearly not meant for human consumption. Now, when you're buying that traffic, you might specify that you're looking for high-end auto intenders. In other words, expensive men and women who want to buy automobiles and read expensive media. So the bots will visit the expensive media and look at car reviews, and then having built up that pattern of behavior and that profile, they'll trigger all of the traffic cops along the way so that everyone knows this is a high-end auto intender, and then they'll return to your site and all those car ads will follow them. That's one form of fraud, and it seems to be a huge one.
Yeah, I think it's something nobody outside the industry has ever heard of. And so that's really interesting. I think, Linda, you wanted to come in. You did the research, Johnny said.
Yeah, so basically there are two ways in order to answer this question. The first one is that advertisers are focusing on personal data, are focusing on demographics, are using separate intermediate parties in order to add some value as they think. And they are willing to buy more for that one specific spot, for that one specific person who is a male of 25 years old with a high income. However, they forget sometimes that I got an example from Snickers. Snickers wants to target males 25 years old and think that males of 25 years old want to buy a Snicker. However, when someone does want to buy a Snicker, it's because they are hungry and they really want to have that Snicker right now. And that's because they are in one specific moment or considering some content. And that's a big difference in order to say if something is more expensive or not. Advertisers are willing to pay a lot for a specific audience. They are also willing to pay a lot for a specific context when they see that it is more valuable and it's more efficient for their conversions or sales. On the other hand, you can say when you distance all the cookie data, you don't need those intermediate parties anymore. So there are a lot less intermediate parties who wants to get something from the pie. Everyone wants to win and everyone gets their share. And when you don't use that, it's a lot more profitable also for advertisers to use the contextual targeting instead of the audience or RTB targeting, because they have more exposure for the same budget. So I hope I could answer that one from a publisher perspective as well.
I think you did. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to the next person in the audience in line. That is Abdelkader. You have the floor. You have to unmute yourself. You're still muted.
Hopefully you should hear me now. Okay, cool. So I just wanted to give a view from another publisher, sales house from Germany. We are one of the largest ones in the German market on two topics. One was the topic regarding data leakage from website audiences. I would agree that in the past it was very difficult for publishers or any other intermediates to make sure that big players like Google wouldn't just grab data and monetize it on other websites. Fortunately, the EIB Europe came up with the TCF standard. I guess you know it, and it has a couple of options. I know one of those options is, as a publisher, now you would have theoretically the option to say, please don't collect the data on my website. Unfortunately, if you have a look now how the big players, in that case I can say it's Google, what kind of how they treat now these topics, they force publishers to allow them to collect data if they want to participate in serving personalized data. So from a regulatory point of view, I would like to see something that says, okay, please decouple those data collection and data usage, sending out of personalized data, because that would stop this first mover disadvantage effect. It would make possible for publishers to say, okay, please, you can monetize with personalized data that you have collected, for example, on a website of an advertiser. So like Adidas saying, okay, I want to do retargeting with my shop. So I'm willing to use my first party data, and a publisher could participate in Adidas buying his own audience, but without having this data leakage. Today, most of the big players do force publishers to accept collecting data if they want to participate in monetizing personalized data. So if you could decouple that, I guess it would greatly help to stop collecting data everywhere without harming immediately the disadvantage effect of the first mover. So I would just say, okay, there are additional options that we could go instead of just banning the RTB business as a total. And the second point, I wanted to point out that the RTB protocol itself would not immediately mean that we have this broadcasting of data. So we could also use the same infrastructure and to do it anonymized by doing real-time bidding without having user identity information within it. Because from our point of view, real-time bidding is a great technology because it has taken out a little, many, let's say, words that was just repetitive. So like getting an order from an advertising by fax and then getting the creative, putting it into the ad server. I guess Linda knows all that kind of business. Today it's automated and we like it. That's much more efficient. So the RTB process itself is more something that doing some stuff efficient. Now then you can think about, okay, how can you make sure that you have those, how to solve those data leakage problems? You can do it RTB anonymized. And if you want to make sure, and advertisers want to make sure that the money they spend is just used on high quality websites, you can still use those private marketplace functionalities within the RTB world. In that case, you still have the one-by-one connection between the advertiser and the publisher. So the advertiser exactly knows where his money is flowing into. So that's the majority also of our business. But there are a lot of public advertisers that really don't care about that because they just optimize for performance. And I guess that this money is, even in a world without personalized data, it's going to go towards those websites with not that content that all of us like. So just turning off personalized data, I guess, is not going to solve the leakage problem when it comes to disinformation, because obviously sometimes the money just falls the eyeballs and the eyeballs are there.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I would just, since we're supposed to come to an end, before I give you the floor to answer that question, I would like to add on a little bit, and then you can maybe tie it up and have your final round statement together with that question, because I think that already touched on a few aspects, like, I mean, where's GDPR coming in there? There were a lot of written questions saying as well, what Johnny, you were saying as well. I mean, the most important point would be to enforce GDPR rather than have additional legislation, but that's so difficult to do in this moment. That maybe sort of addresses the issue of decoupling data collection and usage. And then I would like to add a question, what it is that you would like to see from the DSA. I mean, it's clear that we need, these are very complex issues, and it's not just doing one thing that you solve all the problems of privacy, violation breaches, and disinformation in the internet. But what is the one thing you would like to see in the DSA? And with that, I would like to give the floor to Johnny to answer that question and final statements.
Okay, Abdelkader, thank you for that. And it's really good to hear from a publisher. I agree that RTB could be converted to be anonymous. As currently operated, it still would send the user agent and timestamp in a bid request, even if you put in a dummy ID. So there would be modification required. Now, when the IAB, and I've been a member of the IAB, as you probably are, was first coming up with this daft idea that it calls its transparency and consent, that's a euphemism, protocol. I was a little bit involved in those discussions, and I remember saying to them, to my colleagues there, we need a plan B. Plan A is, yes, let's make this problem go away with this transparency and consent mechanism, but that's not going to work. That will eventually collapse. It's completely illegal. And right now, the APD, the Belgian Data Protection Authority, is considering a number of complaints that are based on my initial GDPR complaint, and TCF is on borrowed time. It's also worth saying that TCF is merely a signaling exercise, right? There are no guarantees that any of the hundreds of companies that might receive bid information are not going to pass it on to business partners. There's no technical measure to back it up. it is not a safeguard for data. Let me also say about Google, that's an interesting point you make. Google, actually on both sides of the Atlantic, forced publishers to accept its terms, and Group M did the same and various others. And some of those terms had to change at different times. I saw just last week from Freedom of Information, a note from the European Commission on a meeting that officials had with Google before the GDPR, in which Google said it would not force publishers to take a particular approach because that would be anti-competitive. So you may hear from some trade bodies of which you're a member on that point. I think Google is very vulnerable because of what it has forced you to do. And as a final note, my wish list for the DSA is in part actually a wish list for the GDPR. I wish that there was some way to force the Irish Data Protection Commission to actually enforce Article 5.1b purpose limitation so that Google couldn't take these data and use it for whatever the hell it wants. And Article 5.1f security, so that we wouldn't have this big RTB data breach. Since that has not happened, and I haven't been able to make it happen, even though I'm here in Ireland throwing stones at them from right up close. Since that hasn't happened, and there's no prospect that it will, maybe we do need stronger measures in the DSA. And that's a reflection on industry intransigence, really from the ad tech industry, and from regulatory incompetence. And it's a terrible reflection actually on all of us that we now need to do this again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Johnny. Who wants to go next? Linda? What do you wish from the DSA?
Yeah, well, I really hope that we can make the whole ecosystem more transparent, and we know that, and be more aware of the fact that the consumers really don't want their personal data to be used for advertising purposes. So why would we still keep focusing on that part? I think there are multiple alternatives, and we can show the context part. And it is possible for big agencies, for big publishers, as well as for the smaller niche publishers as well. So I really hope that everyone gets inspired and can use the alternative ways. Stop focusing on the personal data.
Thank you very much. Tom, briefly, because you as a team, and then Claire will get the last word.
What Linda already said, hopefully what the DSA can achieve is that publishers are starting to experiment with alternative business models. That would be a solution for the whole industry, I guess.
That was brief. Thank you. Claire, you have the floor. You were a little bit cut out in all this technical advertising industry discussion, but you have a minute more for your last words. What would you like to put in?
I'll be very brief as well. I think what would significantly help reduce the amount of harmful content that is polarizing our societies is if rating harmful content was something that was made an industry requirement. That would allow advertisers to choose whether or not they had their ads placed next to harmful content.
That opens up a lot of politically very, very sensitive questions. The rating of harmful content, that might be worse than the advertising industry and the privacy breaches, but we'll think about that. It's, yeah. Thank you very much to everybody. Having all that patience at an hour where usual people have dinner. So thank you very much to the speakers. That was really precious and insightful input. I think it was extremely interesting for everybody to see that. There's still lots of open questions. So maybe we'll follow up on this discussion via Twitter. And please follow us on the social media channels. I'm personally on Twitter, Instagram, and yeah, unfortunately on Facebook because voters are there. Subscribe to our newsletters. We will keep you informed about what is going on with the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and everything digital in the European Parliament. And you will receive a follow-up mail in the following days with a link to the recording. So if you want to see yourselves again or listen in or recommend it to colleagues and friends, feel free to do that. Goodbye. And most important recommendation of all these days, stay safe, stay healthy. Have a wonderful evening.